Andrew Williamson here from Williamson Education. Welcome back. Well, now we've learned about subjects, verbs, and objects. It's time to delve even deeper into the topic of conjugation, one of the most challenging in English grammar. As always with our lessons, we're only beginning a much larger and longer discussion here. Don't feel you need to have understood the entire topic by the end of today's lesson. When I think about subject-verb agreement, I would like to begin with a bit of philosophy. Specifically, I would like us to think about the nature of rules, especially grammatical rules. What's a rule? The answer might seem obvious, but as in just about all cases, a deep dive into the definition of the word helps shed light on things. The Oxford English Dictionary, my favorite source for information about the English language, has several entries for the word rule. Some of these entries date the modern usage of the word back to the year 1225. In essence, our word rule derives from the Old French word rule, which itself derives from the classical Latin word regula, which is a rod for drawing straight lines or measuring. This sense of the word survives quite clearly in our current English language word ruler, a mathematical device for counting inches and feet. The OED goes further with its definition of the word rule in our contemporary language. In fact, the word has many different senses. One meaning of the word rule has to do with limiting our own personal behavior. A rule in this sense is a principle, regulation, or maxim governing individual conduct. Here we might think of the legal rules that tell us, for example, not to steal or kill. The word rule has other senses too. It can refer more generally to the period that a particular leader spends in power, to control, government, dominion, power, sway, an instance of this. When it comes to grammar, though, and to grammatical rules, there is a slightly different definition. This grammatical usage of the word rule has to do with a custom or an agreed-upon meaning that many people lend their support to. In this regard, I would like to call attention to the OED definition of a rule as a principle regulating practice or procedure, a dominant custom or habit. The English language has many principles regulating practice or procedure. Perhaps it has too many. As a matter of fact, rules are easiest to follow when they are simple, few in number, and universal. They work best when they are applied in all relevant instances. The rules of the English language, on the other hand, are complicated, many, and not universal. Rules in English have many exceptions, or moments when a general rule does not apply. For me, because I grew up speaking English in a native environment, the exceptions are part of what makes English so special. English is a hybrid language, meaning that it does not come from a single source. It is impure. It was formed by marrying classical Greek and Latin language with Germanic language traditions. I love this hybridity and the imperfections that come with it. But I know that for just about anyone who did not grow up speaking English as their mother tongue, the exceptions to the rules can prove very frustrating. Perhaps the most important set of rules and exceptions to rules in the English language has to do with the topic of today's lesson, subject-verb agreement. As we've already learned, sentences are organized around verbs or actions and subjects, the people and things that perform those actions. When we use a subject and a verb in a certain sentence, the subject and verb do not just remain apart from each other. They form an agreement, a bond that occurs when the verb is conjugated for the subject. In fact, that word conjugated, as in to conjugate a verb, means something like marrying. In other words, when a verb gets conjugated for its subject, you can think of the subject and the verb as getting married to each other. As with any marriage, the most important question is it a good match? Because in subject-verb agreement, there needs to be a match in the qualities of the subject and the verb in order for them to connect well with each other. When the subject and the verb make a good match, they are said to agree, and the sentence has good subject-verb agreement. A lack of good subject-verb agreement is a major flaw in a sentence, and we need to work hard to make sure that all of your verbs agree with their subjects. How do we decide whether the subject and the verb make a good match? We need first to look at whether the subject and the verb are singular or plural. The word singular refers to a word that represents just one item. The word plural, on the other hand, refers to a word or group of words that represent more than one item. So, for example, if I say the phrase, an apple, you will know that this is a singular phrase, a singular noun. There's just one single apple. If I say the phrase, the car, you will recognize this as a singular phrase. There's just one single car. If I say the phrase, a television, you'll recognize this as singular. There's just one single television. On the other hand, if I say the phrase, the chairs, you'll recognize this as plural. There's more than one chair. The boys is plural. There's more than one boy. And the women is also plural. There's more than one woman. As these examples suggest, the most frequent way that plurals are formed in English is by adding an S to the end of the singular base word. Towers, apartments, players. But there are also irregular plurals that are formed by changing the base word itself. Plurals such as men, children, and even cacti. The reason that the singular plural distinction is so important is that conjugated verbs also have singular and plural forms themselves. For instance, consider the situation when we conjugate the verb to walk. Let's take a look at two examples of sentences. Both of these example sentences have good subject-verb agreement. Here they are. The boy walks. The boys walk. Notice that in the first sentence, the subject of the sentence, the boy, is singular. In the second sentence, the subject of the verb is plural. Now notice that in the first sentence, the verb walks ends with an S, while in the second sentence, there's no S ending on walk. This is a pretty weird feature of the English language, and one of its primary rules. In most third-person singular conjugations, the verb in question ends with S, while in most third-person plural conjugations, the verb ends with no S. In other words, while it's often true that nouns become plural when we add an S to the end, some verbs become singular, at least in the third person, when we add an S to them. Why is this the case? To tell you the honest truth, I don't even know. All I do know is that a rule is a rule is a rule, except when there are exceptions, of course. I want to be clear on this point. Not all singular verbs have an S ending, and not all plural verbs have no S on the end. But this is often the case, and I raise the point because it is usually one of the most difficult for my students to understand, at least at the beginning of their studies of the English language. We will go into greater detail on the question of so-called regular verbs and irregular verbs during a later lesson. For now, though, it's enough for you to know that subjects and verbs need to agree with each other, and that there are certain loose rules for making them agree. These rules do not apply 100% of the time, but they apply in most instances. As we come to the end of this lesson, I would like to offer some words of encouragement. Subject-verb agreement is one of the most important topics in English language grammar. It's also one of the most difficult. There are thousands of verbs in the English language, and many of them have irregular conjugations in the present tense. In fact, some of the most commonly used verbs in English, verbs such as to be, to do, to have, are also irregular verbs. I haven't even begun to discuss the idea of different tenses or times in which a verb might take place. A verb can be regular in the present tense and irregular in the past tense. So all of this is a way of saying, if you find subject-verb agreement to be challenging, then trust me, you are not the only one. That's all for today. Looking forward to our next lesson. Spread the word.